But after things sort of shook out, I wrote to Wizards of the Coast, and I said, by the way, before you bought this company, I just signed this contract with them for my Betrayal at House on the Hill. Would you be interested? And I heard afterwards, many, many years later, that somebody went to the Avalon Hill offices and found this copy of my prototype of Betrayal at House on the Hill back behind a desk somewhere, and they brought it in. And the offices were sort of trashed and everything was all over the place. But they found this copy and they brought it in. And they liked it. And then it went through like a 6 or 7 year long development process, and in which they worked on. And several. The thing about publishing is, once you agree to have your idea published, it kind of leaves your hands. 3 different editors over time took over and reworked the game, came up with various ideas, and then left or were reassigned to other problems, and then somebody else came and worked on it. So the first one was a guy named Rob Daviau, who's become very famous since then for inventing legacy games, which are games where they have a permanent change from one time to another. Legacy Risk, Seafall, Legacy Pandemic are some of his designs, very popular. He worked on it for a while. He had some interesting ideas with different tiers of haunts. So there would be like green ones, yellow ones, and red ones for how difficult the rules were. Because something that they were worried about right from the beginning was how, particularly from the Hasbro point of view, the kinds of games that gamers were interested in wouldn't necessarily transfer over to a more general market. So he was working on that, and I think I might have actually, I could show you some of the different iterations that happened here. So this was the original version that I sent to them. So it had these little tiles. I used the best software I could find at the time, so I've got a little laboratory here with, a little laboratory with a pentacle, a little crypt with coffins, and my staircases, and my hallway. So this was the version, there's the library, this is the version that I actually sold. And then when he'd been working on it for a while, this was one of his versions with sort of this nice particle board. So Rob Daviau worked on it for a while, and he got reassigned. There's the original trader tile. But these are my cards. So they were not too fancy back in 1995. I could do a much better job now than I could back then. Anyway, so he was off of it for a while. Then another guy named Mike Selinker took over, and he came up with his own editions. And at various times along the way, things like my original version had 8-sided dice. They got changed to the 3-sided dice, which it has now, which I think are sort of cool. And the 5-sided character figures, clips and everything, they designed all of that. They got the artwork. And so the game finally came out. I think it got completely canceled at one point. I thought it was never going to happen, but finally came out in 2004. Reasonably successful. Won the Gamer's Choice Award at Origins in 2004. Seemed to be doing fairly well, but one of the editors said, it was kind of before its time. And I said, oh, thank you. And he said, no, I mean, it was not selling as well as we wanted. So it went remaindered for a while. I mean, it was you could get it for 50% off at Toys R Us, and then it was off the shelves. And I was like, well, that's it. But then after that first edition happened, it just kept on having a lot of interest. A lot of people were enthusiastic about it. I think maybe as much as anything, eBay might have had something to do with keeping it going, because prices for it just kept on going up and up, and people were paying $100 and $200 for sets of it on eBay. And I think somebody noticed about that. And then I had another company say, we might be interested in getting the rights for this. And so I looked back at my contract, and when I had done my original contract, I had only had one change to the contract that they said, I said, I want to make sure that if you don't make my game, I get my rights back. So I put that into the contract, that if you don't publish it for a year, I get my rights back. So I wrote and I said, now you stop publishing my game, I'd like to get the rights back so I can sell it to somebody else. And they wrote back to me from Hasbro and they said, oh, no, don't do that. We'll put out a second edition. I said, okay. And that actually gave me a great opportunity, because the first edition, I don't know if you've, you know, the original, if any of you have copies, you know, there's this this cover here, the red and black cover, is the original first edition, and then there's the black and blue yellow. And then there's the black and blue version, which is the later version of the game. And one of the advantages of Board Game Geeks is that people will do these session reports, in which they will have very elaborate, you know, atmospheric, exactly what happens to all the characters and so forth, which are fun to read, but were also immeasurably valuable to me from a playtesting point of view. Because one thing about Betrayal at House on the Hill is it was a bear to playtest. And I cannot, if any of you are interested in game design at all, I cannot overemphasize the importance of playtesting. I truly believe that the difference between a good game and a great game is that a great game has great playtesters. And you know, I described the original process of playtesting Betrayal. By the way, originally it was just the House on the Hill. They added the Betrayal because they thought it could be a sort of a licensing thing, which in fact it has become. But I said the original process of playtesting Betrayal was like, you know, trying to touch a dime on the wall with a 10-foot pole. You know, it's because there's so many things. There's the size of the house, where all the rooms are, where all the people are. Are people, you know, buffed up, or are they all practically dead when the haunt starts? From a balance point of view, whenever you're playing Betrayal at House on the Hill, my goal as a designer is that at some point of the game, someone's going to pick up those dice and say, all right, it's all writing on this roll. If we make this roll, then we have a chance. If we blow this roll, we're dead. Or, you know, if we make this roll, we win, but if we blow the roll, keep on going. But, you know, the game should hinge on one die roll at some point of the game. And I don't really care exactly what your odds are on that die roll, but if you never feel like you have a chance, like this trader just, you know, blew us away, the monster was too tough, there's no way we possibly could have won, then that's my failure as a game designer. Or if it's the other way, you know, the trader feels like, yeah, these guys were just, another thing, how many players are there going to be? You know, I try to balance them all for the number of players, but 6 players versus 3 players, it's a big difference. So I'm trying to, so that was what made it so difficult to play test. But if you ever get down to that one die roll, you can just remember that means that I win as the game designer. Whenever I'm playing the game, that's what I'm hoping for. So, so when I did the second edition, I went through all of those playtest results, and every time every record I could find, every time I played the game, I tried to take notes. And you know, was it too easy? Was it too hard? What happened? Were the rules clear? Were there any questions involved? And I was able to make many changes on all the scenarios. There were a couple of scenarios that I tossed out. They were too complex. They didn't make sense. They were not well balanced. I also had a little contest that I put up on Board Game Geek. If anybody has their own scenarios, send them in. And in fact, there were a couple of people who have actually written entire books of their own scenarios. And one guy, I think I actually ended up using about 2 or 3 of his ideas. And I gave him credit, of course, in the second edition. Let's see, the one about where the house is picked up by a giant rock and carried off, and they're all trying to fight over the parachute. That was one. Yeah, I had a really complex one based on the picture of the Black Lagoon. It just wasn't working out. So some of my ideas. By the way, not all the scenarios, even in the original edition, were mine. The lower numbers tend to be mine. The higher numbers were other editors. They took out some of my 50 and added other ones. So if it's good, then it's mine. So anyway, so then the second edition came out, and it seemed to be doing very well, but what really turned it around, and my all-time favorite, greatest actor who has ever walked the stage is, as far as I'm concerned, is Will Wheaton from Star Trek. Wesley Crusher, you know, never say anything bad about him around me, because he did the game on tabletop with some of his friends, and after that, sales just shot up, and they've kept up ever since. This was about 4 or 5 years ago, and it's just been steadily building ever since. And it seems to sort of have achieved critical mass now, and especially now that they've started doing expansions. And, about a year ago, they put out the expansion last Halloween, Widow's Walk. I was not directly involved in that myself. I actually have my own idea for an expansion, which I've been pitching to Hasbro for several years, and they were pretty enthusiastic about it, and then suddenly they said, yeah, we just decided to do something else. And they did this Widow's Walk instead. Again, that's what happens when you work with a big company. You know, you can write them all the emails you want, but the actual decision-making process is distant and opaque. So they, but as it turned out, the Widow's Walk, they did it on a fairly short time scale, and I probably wouldn't have been able to get mine together in that amount of time anyway. But they went to Mike Selinker, who had his own company, and he, if you're familiar with Widow's Walk at all, and I think it's a good idea, he got all these gaming celebrities, people like Zoe Quinn and so forth, to submit ideas for scenarios, and he worked those out into this version. I submitted one of my own. So I had some involvement, but again, it was kind of distant from. And I believe that they're now going to be continuing the franchise. This year, Betrayal of Baldur's Gate came out, which is using some of the same mechanics in a D&D universe. And again, I'm not involved in any of these directly, but still get money for them, so. That's the only thing that's better about, you know, creating something and getting paid for the work that you put into it is getting paid for work that you not put in. So that's most of the story about Betrayal. And why don't I pause and see if there's some questions, and then maybe I'll come back and tell you about my other games later on too, maybe a little bit more about my design process. Does anybody have any questions about Betrayal? Yeah?
Well, it's, didn't you even go a little bit more into detail about like your playtesting and design process, specifically for like the asymmetrical part of it? A lot of the design process for this or any game, well, I'll go ahead and go through my whole design process for how a game works in general. Are any of you like trying to design your own games, board games, or anything like that? Okay, great. So first of all, every game, for me at least, every game starts with the spreadsheet. As soon as I come up with an idea, you know, I think about it for a while, but usually the first document I will open will be Excel, and I'll start listing stuff. Because every game's got something, you know, it's got cards, it's got tiles, it's got, you know, pieces, and usually by the end of the design process, that Excel spreadsheet for any game has got, you know, 9 or 10 pages and cross-index. I would definitely recommend any of you who are interested in board game design process, learn as much as you can about Excel, because it is hugely useful. Even though it doesn't look it, I mean, Betrayal is maybe not too obvious, but many games, if you really pull up the hood and really look at how the game is put together, there's a lot of math in a lot of games. You know, there's a lot of statistics, there's a lot of you know, cross-indexing and so forth. And so using formulae, you know, constants and variables and so forth. Any game with an economic system. You know, I've worked on some games where there's trading or things like that. And And some of those calculations that get involved can be extremely complex. And so again, really good working knowledge of Excel is crucial. And I say this as an English major, as an English professor, and I've got a PhD in English literature. But, I took all the college classes of, calculus and so forth. I've never needed any of that. But the kinds of math that go into board games, I'm using all the time. And I don't go with this idea, oh, I'm creative, I don't need to know any math. Definitely, if you're interested in games, you need a lot of math. So everything starts with a spreadsheet. Beyond that, my other advice for anybody who's interested in their own game design, a couple of years ago, I realized that this stuff was not going to cut it anymore in the modern society, the modern playtest environment. I started playtesting other people's games. I was like, these look really nice. So I took at the community college I attended, I signed up for a class that one of my colleagues was teaching in graphic design. And so I would recommend learning InDesign and Illustrator and all those programs to do your own graphics design. You want your game to look nice. Maybe the publishers will look at it if it's just sort of little 3x5 cards that you cut out, but the better graphics you have, and sometimes I will even go out and scrape pictures from the internet and put them. Of course you can't sell those with copyright and everything, but just for a prototype, so that you've got a game that has a good looking prototype that you can send out. Let's see. And then once you've got your, as far as making decisions about balance and so forth, a lot of the process involves, as I'm writing stuff up, I'm constantly playing the game in my head. And something you don't quite realize when you're playing the finished product is when the game is still in your head, there have been a number of times when I've been partway through the design process and I've said, uh-oh, what if a player does this? Or is this particular strategy, maybe this might not be fun. Is this actually going to be enjoyable? Is this going to create that feeling that I want? And you really have to kind of sit yourself down in that imaginary table and take all the different roles and sort of go through the turns in your head many, many times to make sure that there's nothing you're missing. Because I have designed games where I've sat them down on the table, and I've worked on it for a month or two, and I finally get a prototype, I sit it down on the table, and at the end, I'm like, did anybody really enjoy that? Nope, okay, back on the shelf it goes. Maybe in a couple of years I'll have another idea and make it playable, but sometimes it's just not going to go anywhere. Let's see. If a game does look like it's got potential, a big part of play testing is, in my opinion, record keeping. I've had people, I've play tested with designers where they're not writing anything down. I say, how can you even do that? You should always be, some of my games, my friends say, well, this is great because we never have to pick up the game afterwards because I pull out my computer and I'm recording everything, all the cards that have been played and in what order and so forth, so that I can, and that goes on another spreadsheet, so that I can then go back over it and compare the data and say, this game, it's got 53 cards in it, and they're all different, and I've got data going back for years. My brother actually wrote a computer program with an artificial intelligence that I could play against, and I literally played against that artificial intelligence and recorded the results of hundreds of games with what cards were in each winning hand and what their average score was, so that I could get a sense of, are there some cards that are just better than others? Are there some bonuses that I need to bump up? Again, that's kind of what I think playtesting requires, and probably something that not all game designers do enough of. Sometimes games do get rushed out the door, and that doesn't really benefit anyone. Any other questions? Yes?
Could you speak on how you fit narrative into role-playing systems?
Sure. Yeah, Betrayal kind of fits in a, I don't know, I think of it as a subgenre. I call it the heroic role-playing game, where instead of playing a faction or playing a country or playing a nation or doing something abstract, each person's playing a character. And there's science fiction games and a lot of other games that are like that. As a literature professor, I do think a lot about story. And can a game tell a story? I think it can. I think that many of the aspects of literature are present in something like Betrayal. You've got establishment of a situation. There are these characters. They're in a haunted house. Rising tension. Weird things are happening. A moment of revelation. What is going on in this house when you discover the haunt? And then the building climax. Do you defeat whatever the bad guy is or not? By the way, another thing probably related to your question. If you play Betrayal at House on the Hill a lot, part of my narrative strategy for that game is that I don't want there to be just sort of a toe-to-toe fight at the end of the game. Sometimes you get that in video games, it's like, all right, we've got our weapons that deal the big damage and the bad guy deals big damage, we need to take down their health meter before they take down our health meter. And I say that there are some games, but most games have gotten away from that. Part of this comes from my experience as a game master in role-playing campaigns, but also you see this in movies. I think that usually the most interesting fights are the ones where the good guys feel like the bad guy has them cold. You cannot win. We are overwhelmed. This is something that we cannot fight directly. And so you have to find an indirect way to face off with the bad guy. And so many of the haunts are like that. They are, instead of, we've got to take this health meter down to 0. There are a couple of those. But most of them are, this guy is going to kill us unless we find all the pieces to the ritual. We can assemble an exorcism by making these rolls in all of these different rooms. We have to find all the pieces for all the ingredients for the plant poison so that we can poison the vines. And so instead of confronting the bad guy, you have to avoid whatever it is that's trying to kill you for long enough to put together the pieces to defeat it. Or, it might be one bad thing that's stalking you around and killing you off one by one. It might be a whole bunch of things where there are more and more small things that are going to kill you eventually. And sometimes some of the haunts there's nothing corporeal at all. It's just there are things that are going to be lowering your health. And basically, the monster of the game, whatever it is that's I think of it as the threat, is more like a timer than anything else. It's putting a limit on how long you survive, and you have to accomplish X task within a certain number of turns before whatever the threat is kills you. And so that's the narrative structure that I'm going.